Hello there, sword friends. I thought I would do a quick video on how to take a sword apart. Now, this video is not going to be in the most traditional of senses, but rather how I do it. There are other tutorials on how one might traditionally take apart a sword, or if there is some sort of ritual to it or something like that. I'm not really going to elaborate on any of that stuff, so if that's what you're looking for, I would advise you to look elsewhere. What I'm going to talk about though is how I take apart a sword, and maybe some general gists on stuff. First off, when you're taking a sword apart, couple things to note which are going to be awkward for this tutorial, but when you have a sword apart, don't talk. When you have said sword in your hand and the blade is out, your saliva and just talking to the sword and rambling on, as I often do, can get little bits of saliva on the sword, which over time can develop into pitted bits of rust, which is a bit of a bummer. So ideally, don't talk to the sword. Don't have a conversation with it. Just take it out and then do your damn thing. Another question that might come up before I get into it is, why the hell would you want to take apart a sword? You often need to do that in order to properly clean the blade. Why would you have to clean the blade? Well, because you want it to last for a long time. It's said that Japanese swords have been lasted through the generations, and that's only partially true. They've been preserved through the generations. People have gone out of their way to take care of them. One of the ways that they do that is by properly cleaning it. To do that, you often need to disassemble the blade to get under the habaki, to hold the nakago, to have it in your hand, to clean and fully pay attention to the entire blade and not just the other bits. Now that might just be from a collector standpoint, but from the standpoint of a practitioner, if you're cutting water bottles, if you're cutting things that are wet, sometimes things can dribble down your sword, get under the habaki, and that part can rust. There's also a lot of strain that goes in that part of the blade, so if it rusts pretty completely over time, it could cause catastrophic failure of a blade, though admittedly that would take a very, very long time. Still, if you don't want it to rust and look ugly, you take it apart and clean under the habaki area, which is the blade collar here. So I'm going to break that cardinal rule of talking, because otherwise this video would be very silent. The first thing that you do, ideally you have one of these handy dandy little tools that's like for pushing out push pins, and there is something called the makugi here. This is a little pin that can be pressed out of the sword. It's usually bigger on one side and smaller on the other, otherwise I guess it couldn't be bigger on one side. A little pin like this that holds the blade in. That goes through the makugi ana. That just means the hole the makugi goes in. And then that's what's securing the blade in. Some newer production swords have 2, even 3 of these. Most older Japanese swords will have only 1. All you're supposed to have to do is give your wrist a firm little tap, and then it kind of pops. At that point, you can pull the sword out, the habaki comes down, and you can clean the sword. Yay, it's just as simple as that. Then you put it back together, put your habaki back on, put it back in the tsuka core, give it a pop, take your little makugi and push it back in, and you're done. Hooray for taking the sword apart. That's as simple as it's supposed to be, but very often it's not. A lot of times, changes in humidity, changes in anything, sometimes production swords or the handles are partially glued on or have some sort of coating on them to get the finish to fit properly, so they may not fit that way. Here's another example. This is my practice sword, and you can see that getting at this makugi is proving to be problematic, so I'm going to whack it with a hammer a little bit. That's probably obscenely loud. There's my makugi, and now let's see if it works. No. And if I push, it doesn't come out. And if I do this too much, it would probably hurt me. So the other thing I do, if you have really old antique fittings, this isn't a good idea, but most of the time these things are pretty durable. I just give them a little light tap. Now in doing this, you can deform your habaki. The habaki has this, again, blade collar here, and it is made out of a lighter metal than the sword, or a softer metal. So when it bangs in to the steel, it can deform, and then it will be loose for all time, which is a real bummer. So this is loosening it up, but it's certainly not loose enough to come off yet. In the saya, I'll sometimes put the saya on because I don't want it to break, or rather come back and smack me. And I'll give it a little tap this way. Now I'm trying to just do it enough until I can remove the suka by itself. But this does not seem to want to go. Now don't smack on it too hard. What can happen is, especially as I'm doing this, is it could cut through the saya. And make no mistake, what I'm doing right now is largely irresponsible. There are better tools to do this, absolutely. But giving it just a little bit of room that it needs, I'm then able to remove the handle. Take off the suba and habaki. And now I can clean my blade. Now what you might be able to see here is this little shadow around my habaki, right? Well, I've been pretty lazy the last few times I've cleaned my shinken, and in a nutshell, I've used Mother's Mag to polish it. I've tried to keep it away from the habaki, but this little residue line that you see is the result of Mother's Mag, or the metal polish that I use to clean the sword after cutting, getting underneath the habaki and leaving a kind of an ugly little bit of residue there. And this is with me trying to wipe away from it, trying to keep that area of the sword clean, but nevertheless, it still ends up getting in there. The same happens with water. It'll creep down the habaki, get on the nakago, and could rust this area out more so than it should. But now that the sword is out of the sai, or out of the suka, I'm able to clean the sword fully, get under the habaki, address any areas, and hooray. Now when you're cleaning a sword, you don't clean the handle, this part, you don't apply oils or anything, you just grip it. It's gonna rust, it's meant to rust. The oil from your hands will develop a patina over time that is normal and appropriate, but you're not really supposed to clean this part of the sword. There are very rare circumstances where that is not the case. I mean, if you have a sword that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and has a signature from someone very historically relevant, and that signature is beginning to wear away because of the patina that has gathered over almost a millennia, at that point, maybe apply a bit of oil just to preserve the handle in its current state. However, I would venture a guess that if you're listening to me talk, that is probably not a problem that you have. So, there we go. We got the sword apart. Now, we're going to put it back together. Presumably, you would have completed your cleaning. Keep in mind that most of these only go on one way. If you set your stuff down and you forget which way it is, most of the time, hopefully the camera will pick this up, there's a little indentation on this seppa that shows the outline of the habaki. So without really paying attention, because I certainly wasn't when I put it down, I know that this seppa went under the habaki because it had a little indentation there. Sometimes the seppa are different sizes as well, so try to keep track of which way it goes. Then we take it, while I have this apart as I'm rambling, this one appears to be rather tight, so I'm not going to get it off, not without some fussing. Ideally, I would take this off. I don't really want to fuss with it, but the point is, look inside your suka core here through the kind of nakago ana. That just means nakago hole. At least I think that's what it means. But the hole that the nakago goes in, and you can look and see if your suka core is cracked. There's going to be a seam usually on both sides, so you might see a small line here and there. That doesn't mean that it's cracked, but look for any other abrasions or anything like that, or cracks that run down the core. If you can take the fuchi off and see around the outside, see if the wood is cracked at all. It's a good thing to know if it's cracked, because that can mean that the handle might break at some point. Not necessarily immediately. I've used a lot of swords with cracked suka that have lasted for a very long time with a cracked suka and haven't prevented me from using it in any kind of functional way. But it's still good to know, especially if it's really bad or there's chunks of it falling out or something like that. You'll know that the sword is probably very dangerous to use and not a good idea. Sword only goes in one way, and now I'm going to have the same problem. This suka was very tight, so I give it a little bang on the bottom until it goes all the way through. The other thing that you can do is bang it on something hard. You know, if you have some really fancy adornments or something like that, it's probably not a great idea, but I don't, and this is a user sword. This will also probably be very loud because of the camera, but I give it a thump. Now, if you probably can't see it too well here, but if I'm able to see light through the makugi hole, I'm able to see that the hole and the hole in the wood line up. Then I take my makugi, I put it back in. It should go in without too much issue. Give it a little tap. I use a much larger hammer. A lot of folks use something smaller like this. I find that more cumbersome than it's worth. I just give it a little bit of whack, and now it's back in there. Now you can see that mine is pretty tight. It hasn't loosened. My habaki isn't messed up. It's not wiggling around. My sword doesn't have any creaks in it. So it went back together even though I banged on it with a hammer. And it's just something that periodically is going to happen if you have production swords. I've noticed that I've had to do this on a lot of Hanwei and other Chinese production type swords because the sword, I don't know if it's the humidity, the travel, or what happens if the handle shrinks, but some of them can be just an awful bear to get off. Once you have the makugi out, sometimes just be responsible and try to get the handle off as gently as you can. Sometimes a rubber mallet rather than a straight up metal one. I'm not overly particular about any damage that happens to the tsuba or any dings that it has. It's just character, just like scratches in a truck bed. Anyway, that's in a nutshell how I take the handle off a sword. I also use not chojo, but I'll put either Mother's Mag on them to clean them. I covered that in another video. And then I will coat them in CLP if I'm storing them. This one I don't because I use it pretty much weekly, and so it doesn't really require any constant oil. Otherwise I'd just be cleaning it off every class. It gets cleaned once a week. But for other swords like the Kodo wakizashi that you saw there, very often I'll use CLP as a medium to store that in oil after cleaning it. That's all I have for you. I hope it helped. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.